The last letters of Ugarit. Maybe tonight is one of those nights when the room feels a little too awake. Not loud exactly, just awake. A sound from outside, a thought that comes back after you already told it to leave. The ceiling above you, the dark around the edges of things. That is all right. We do not need to fight the night. Not yet. Tonight, we are going to let it take us somewhere else. Not somewhere peaceful at first, but somewhere old, somewhere by the sea. A city on the coast of what is now Syria. A city that once listened to the whole eastern Mediterranean through its harbour. A city called Ugarit. If you were here last time, we looked at the end of the Bronze Age from far away, the large shape of it. Kings writing to kings, ships carrying copper, tin, grain, oil, timber and news. Palaces counting everything, scribes pressing lists into clay. A world connected by roads, treaties, marriages, gifts, threats and habits. And then the habits began to fail. Ships arrived late, messages took longer, storehouses thinned, empires became tired. Cities that once trusted the wider world began to discover that trust can break quietly. But tonight, we are not going to hold the whole collapse at once. It is too large, too many kingdoms, too many fires, too many causes stacked on top of each other. Tonight, we make the world smaller. One coast, one port, one palace, one archive, one king named Amurapi, and a few last letters written in clay while the old world was already coming apart. You are in the Insomnia Club, and tonight we are listening to the last letters of Ugarit. Ugarit was not the largest power of the late Bronze Age. It was not Egypt, old and heavy with gods and river light. It was not the Hittite Empire, ruling from the highlands of Anatolia. It was not Babylon. It was not Assyria. It was a smaller kingdom, and on a map it can look almost delicate, pressed between larger names. But that can be misleading. Some places matter not because they are enormous, but because they sit at a crossing point. Ugarit was one of those places. The city stood a little inland from the Mediterranean, at a site now called Ras Shamra. Its harbour was nearby, at Minet el Beida, where the sea opened the city to Cyprus, the Levant, Egypt, Anatolia, and the Aegean. That harbour was not just a place where boats tied up, it was the city's ear. Through it, Ugarit heard the world, a cargo arriving from Cyprus, a trader speaking of trouble farther west, a messenger from the Hittite world, a shipment of timber, a jar of oil, a letter sealed and carried across water, a rumour wet with salt, repeated in a warehouse before it reached the palace. Ports know things early. That is their gift. And sometimes, near the end of an age, that is also their curse. For a long time, Ugarit's place in the world made it rich. It stood between sea routes and inland roads. Goods moved through it. Officials counted them. Merchants made arrangements. Priests served the gods. Scribes kept records. Families lived in houses and worried about ordinary things, not the end of civilization. That is the first thing to remember. Before Ugarit was a ruin, it was a normal place to the people who lived there. Normal does not mean simple, it means daily. It means someone had work in the morning, someone owed money, someone was angry with a neighbor, someone was waiting for a ship, someone was sick, someone had just repaired a door, someone had a child who would not sleep, someone was grinding grain, carrying water, checking a storehouse, learning a trade, or walking through a street they knew so well, they no longer really saw it. Disaster becomes easier to understand when we remember that it arrives in places where people have routines. It does not always arrive as a grand historical event. Sometimes it arrives as a delay, a missing ship, a nervous official, a price that rises, a message that should have come and does not. Ugarit was a city of records. That is why we can sit with it tonight. At many ancient sites, life disappeared into earth without leaving many words. Buildings fell, fires burned, memories faded, and the small details of fear were lost. But Ugarit wrote. Its scribes wrote in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age. They wrote in Ugaritic too, their own local language using a special alphabetic cuneiform script. Other languages and writing systems appear as well. Hittite, Hurrian, Cypro-Minoan signs. The city was not closed in on itself. It lived inside a many-voiced world. That matters. A place with many scripts is a place of contact. A palace that keeps tablets in different languages is not only ruling itself, it is dealing with other people, other powers, other gods, other customs, other systems of value. The archive of Ugarit was not one kind of thing. It held royal correspondence, legal texts, accounts, rituals, myths, lists, treaties, practical matters, beautiful things and boring things. And the boring things are important. History often survives not in the great speech, but in the receipt, in the order, in the complaint, in the message someone wrote because something needed to be done. A monument tells you what a ruler wanted remembered. An archive tells you what a kingdom had to manage. And Ugarit had a great deal to manage. It was tied to the Hittite world. In the late Bronze Age, Ugarit was a subject state under Hittite authority. It kept its own kings, but those kings lived within the political weight of a larger empire. That could be useful. A smaller kingdom near great powers often survives by belonging to someone's order. It pays, it obeys, it negotiates, it accepts rank. In return, it expects some measure of protection, legitimacy, and stability. In calm times, this can look strong. The small kingdom is not alone. It has a place in the system. But systems are only as strong as their ability to answer when pressure comes. A treaty cannot walk down a road. A title cannot pull a ship back from another coast. An empire can still speak with the voice of command after its hands have grown weak. That is one of the quiet problems at the end of the Bronze Age. Many things still had names: king, vassal, ally, harbour, army, fleet, palace, letter. But a name is not the same thing as power. Near the end, Ugarit seems to have been caught in the distance, between the old names and the new reality. Its king, Hammurapi, is the figure who remains closest to us in this final chapter. He is not famous in the way Rameses is famous. He does not stand in the popular imagination like Achilles or Agamemnon, or a pharaoh carved on a temple wall. Hammurapi is quieter than that. He is memorable because he appears near the end, not as a legend, but as a man trying to manage a crisis. The last known king of Ugarit, a king with scribes, a king with obligations, a king with a city by the sea, a king who needed help. And this is where the story becomes very human, because Hammurapi did not write from the safety of a finished history. He did not know he was part of something later people would call the Bronze Age collapse. He did not know that scholars, thousands of years later, would read his letters with a strange kind of pity. He was inside the event, and people inside events do not have clean explanations. They have problems. The enemy has come. The ships are away. The troops are away. The damage is real. What can be done? One of the late letters connected with Hammurapi was sent to the king of Alashia, a name usually understood as Cyprus. It is a formal letter with royal language, with the shape of diplomacy still around it. But underneath the old formal skin, the letter is frightened. Enemy ships had come. Damage had been done. Hammurapi explains that his troops and chariots are in Hatti, away in the Hittite world. His ships are in the land of Lucca, also away. So the city is exposed. The line often remembered from that correspondence is simple and terrible. The country is abandoned to itself, not abandoned in the poetic sense, not as a metaphor, abandoned as a practical fact. The army is not here, the ships are not here, the danger is here. That is enough. We do not need to exaggerate it. The truth is already frightening. Imagine being responsible for a city when the things that should defend it exist only somewhere else. On a tablet, in a list, in a memory, in another land. The kingdom has troops, but not where the kingdom needs them. The kingdom has ships, but not in the harbor. The kingdom has relationships, but relationships need time to become help, and time may be exactly what Ugarit no longer has. There is another detail from the late correspondence. 7 enemy ships caused serious damage. 7, not a huge number in the imagination, not an army darkening the horizon, not 1,000 sails. 7 ships. And maybe that is why the detail works so well. Because collapse is not always caused by something that sounds large enough afterward. A city can be caught at the wrong hour. A fleet can be away. A road can be cut. An empire can be distracted. An ally can be too slow. And then a small number of ships becomes enough. Enough to burn. Enough to frighten. Enough to show that the old system is not answering quickly enough. We should be careful about the enemy. This is where the story often becomes too easy. People say, "The sea peoples came," and the sentence appears to explain everything. It does not. The sea peoples are real in the sense that Egyptian records describe several groups, moving by land and sea during this period. Some fought Egypt, some appear with families, some may have been invaders, migrants, raiders, displaced communities, or all of these in different combinations. The name itself is partly a modern convenience. It gathers many unclear movements under one dramatic label. That does not mean the danger was imaginary. It was not. But if we turn the sea peoples into one dark army from nowhere, we make the past too simple. And Ugarit does not need a simple story. It needs a careful one. For someone standing near the harbor, the distinction may not have mattered much. A ship is either expected or it is not. A sail on the horizon is either trade, news, return, rescue, or danger. And if the coast is already vulnerable, even uncertainty becomes a form of fear. That is the atmosphere we need to keep, not a fantasy of barbarians ending civilization. A real port city watching the sea, and not knowing what the next ship will bring. Ugarit had always lived from movement. The sea brought wealth. The sea brought language. The sea brought copper from Cyprus and goods from other shores. The sea connected the city to the wider Bronze Age world. But near the end, the same sea became uncertain. The thing that once made Ugarit open also made it exposed. There is a lesson there, but let us not turn it into a slogan. The people of Ugarit did not need a lesson. They needed their ships back. Let us go inside the palace for a while. Not the palace as a ruin. The palace as a working building, rooms with shelves, clay tablets, storerooms, officials. The smell of oil lamps and dust. People coming in and out with news, requests, arguments, deliveries, complaints. A palace in the late Bronze Age was not just a residence. It was an administrative machine. It gathered goods, redistributed them, recorded labor, managed obligations, communicated with other powers, and tried to make a complex world legible. That is what scribes did. They made life recordable. A shipment becomes a tablet. A dispute becomes a tablet. A ritual becomes a tablet. A warning becomes a tablet. The scribe does not control the world, but he gives the world a form that can travel. There is something powerful in that, and something very small. Because a tablet can carry a message across distance, but only if the roads and ships still work. Only if the person receiving it can do something. Only if there is still time. Think of the scribe writing Amurapi's warning. He prepares the clay. He smooths it. He takes the stylus. He knows the opening formulas. Respect, rank, proper address. The old rules matter, even during fear. Maybe the king dictates. Maybe an official does. The scribe presses the signs. The enemy ships came. The cities were harmed. My troops and chariots are away. My ships are away. The country is abandoned to itself. The hand moves carefully. The words are urgent, but the work must still be precise. That is the strange thing about administration in a crisis. The forms remain even when the content becomes panic. People do not instantly become different because the world around them is failing. They still use the language they know. They still follow procedure. They still seal documents. They still ask for help through the same channels that worked before. Every urgent letter is a small act of faith. It says, there is still a listener. There is still a road. There is still a future in which this message matters. We know more than they did. That is why these letters hurt. We know Ugarit was destroyed around the end of the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE. We know it was not rebuilt as the same city kingdom. We know the archives stopped. They did not know that when they wrote. Or maybe, near the very end, some of them began to suspect it. That is a different kind of fear. To keep writing after you suspect the answer may not come. There were gods in Ugarit too. We should not forget that. This was not only a city of merchants and scribes. It was a city of temples, rituals, offerings, and divine names. Texts from Ugarit have given us stories of Baal, the storm god, and El, and Anat, and Dagon, and other figures from the religious world of the ancient Levant. The famous Baal cycle, preserved in Ugaritic tablets, is one of the reasons the city matters so much, for understanding ancient Near Eastern religion. In those myths, the gods speak and fight and rule. Storms have meaning. Death has a house. Power moves between divine figures in a language that feels both strange and familiar. But in the last letters, the loudest thing is not myth. It is logistics. Where are the troops? Where are the ships? What has the enemy done? What city is destroyed? Who can answer? That contrast is worth sitting with. A culture can have beautiful myths and still fall because practical systems fail. Not because the myths were false or weak, but because grain, roads, ships, soldiers, timing, and political protection belong to a different kind of reality. A storm god may be worshipped in the temple, but the city still needs its fleet. Maybe someone prayed. It would be strange if they did not. Maybe people brought offerings, asked Baal for protection, asked the gods to turn danger away from the coast. We do not have to invent a specific scene. We only have to remember that people in ancient cities did not live in separate boxes called politics, religion, trade, and fear. All of it was one life. A king might send a letter and make an offering. A sailor might curse the wind and think of a god. A mother might hear rumors from the harbor and whisper a prayer before sleep. The archive gives us the official voice, but the city had many other voices we cannot hear. That is one of the limits of history. The powerful speak longer. Kings survive in letters. Scribes survive in handwriting. Officials survive in records. But the ordinary people of Ugarit were there too. A worker carrying jars through a palace corridor. A woman buying grain and noticing the measure is smaller. A child watching adults speak quietly. A sailor's family waiting for a ship from Lucca. A farmer from the land around the city, hearing that threshing floors have been attacked. A servant in the palace understanding from tone, not words, that something is wrong. Archives do not preserve everyone equally. So we have to be careful. We should not pretend to know what they said, but we can leave room for them. Because the fall of Ugarit was not only the fall of Amurape, it was the fall of a lived place. The late letters mention damage beyond the palace world. There are references to destruction in the countryside: food, vineyards, cities, fields. Some texts are fragmentary. We cannot make them cleaner than they are, but the direction is clear. The danger was not abstract. It touched food, and when danger touches food, it touches everyone. A burned palace is dramatic. A burned threshing floor is survival. The elite may lose authority. The poor may lose bread, and bread is more important than authority when the night comes. This is how a collapse becomes ordinary, not less terrible, more terrible, because it enters the things people need tomorrow morning. The world of Ugarit had long depended on connections. Copper from Cyprus mattered. So did the wider Hittite order. So did inland agriculture. So did safe coastal movement. So did the confidence of merchants. So did the habit of kings answering kings. If one part failed, perhaps the city could absorb it. Cities can survive trouble. They had survived trouble before: a bad harvest, a raid, a diplomatic problem, a damaged road, a delayed ship. None of those alone has to end a city. But when several pressures arrive together, the city does not face one problem. It faces a tightening circle. The sea becomes unsafe. The roads become uncertain. The great power above you weakens. Your troops are pulled away. Your ships are elsewhere. Your enemies, whoever exactly they are, move faster than your messages. Then the question is no longer only, what caused the fall? The question is, how could the city recover? Recovery is the part people forget. Ancient cities burned before. Earthquakes came before. War came before. Famine came before. The difference between disaster and collapse is often whether the system can recover after the blow. Can the walls be rebuilt? Can food arrive? Can workers be organized? Can the king still command belief? Can allies still answer? Can trade resume? Can the next harvest be protected? If the answer is yes, a city may survive even a terrible year. If the answer is no, even a smaller blow can become final. Ugarit's final crisis seems to have come when recovery was running out, not only for Ugarit, for the wider world around it. The Hittite Empire was under pressure. Egypt was facing serious threats. The Aegean palace world was breaking down. Cyprus was changing. Movement across the sea was dangerous. The old network was not dead everywhere at once, but it was no longer reliable. And Ugarit was a network city. It had gained from the system. It suffered when the system failed. There is no need to blame Ugarit for that. Every city is shaped by the world that feeds it. Ugarit knew how to be Ugarit. A port kingdom, a palace kingdom, a diplomatic kingdom, a city of trade, scribes, gods, archives, and obligations. It could not become something else overnight. That is another quiet tragedy of collapse. The skills that built a world are not always the skills that save it. When that world changes, a merchant knows old routes, a scribe knows old forms, a king knows old alliances, a sailor knows old harbors. But if the routes fail, the forms slow down, the alliances weaken and the harbors burn, then the old knowledge becomes painful, still real, still valuable, but not enough. Let us return to the harbor. The harbor is important because it gives this story a shape we can feel. Imagine it at evening. No need to make it too dramatic. Just a working port near the end of a long day. The sun going down over the water, men finishing labor, ropes damp in their hands, jars set down in rows, a clerk angry because a shipment is incomplete. Someone asks whether the ship from Cyprus has been seen. Someone says no. Someone says it should have come yesterday. Someone else says the coast is not safe. Maybe no one says much after that. A port changes mood before a palace admits it. The absence of ships is not empty, it is information. Every missing sail says something. At first people explain it. Weather, delay, a difficult captain, a late departure, a minor trouble at another port. Humans are good at explaining away the first signs of danger because ordinary life needs those explanations. But after enough delays, excuses become thinner. The harbour begins to feel wrong, and a city that lives by arrival begins to fear the horizon. That fear enters the palace as reports. It enters the market as prices. It enters houses as whispers. It enters sleep as a question. What is coming? One of the hardest things about Ugarit is that it knew enough to be afraid. This was not ignorance. This was not a city surprised by the existence of other powers. It knew the world. It had records, diplomats, merchants, treaties, scribes, gods and routes. It could name places far away. It could send messages to kings. It could understand that the trouble was not small. But understanding and control are not the same thing. Hammurabi may have understood the danger very well. That did not mean he could bring the troops home in time. The scribe may have written the problem clearly. That did not make the sea safe. A merchant may have known the old route was too risky. That did not create a new route. Sometimes history gives people enough knowledge to suffer clearly, but not enough power to change the ending. That is a hard thought, but we can sit with it for a moment. No need to rush past it. There are other late Bronze Age letters from the wider region that carry a similar feeling. Appeals for grain, complaints about danger, requests for ships, warnings from one ruler to another. These were not written by people who thought everything was fine. The old world was talking to itself, but talking is not the same as healing. A sick system can produce a lot of messages. In fact, sometimes it produces more messages near the end. More reports, more orders, more requests, more explanations, more promises, more tablets, more attempts to make the old machine move. And maybe that is what we see at Ugarit, the old machine trying to work one more time. The king asks, the scribe writes, the tablet is sent. But the world outside the tablet is moving faster. Ships do not wait for handwriting. Fire does not wait for diplomatic rank. An enemy at the coast does not care whether the correct title has been used. This is the nightmare hidden inside administration. Not that administration is useless. Most of the time it is what lets a complex world function. But it needs time. It needs stable channels. It needs people who can answer. When those things fail, the forms remain in place for a while, like furniture in a house after the roof is gone. The letter still looks like a letter. The seal still looks like authority. The title still sounds powerful. But the help is not there. This is where Ugarit becomes more than a footnote. The city lets us see the Bronze Age collapse not as a dramatic explosion, but as a failure of response. A city needed an answer. The answer was too late, or not enough, or never arrived. That is one of the simplest ways to understand a collapse. It is not just that bad things happen. Bad things always happen. It is that the old system can no longer answer them. Now, we should say something about the modern discovery of Ugarit, because it has its own quiet strangeness. For thousands of years, the city was not famous in the way some ancient places were famous. It was not carried through Western memory like Troy. It did not stand above ground as an obvious monument calling people to it. Then, in the 20th century, the site at Ras Shamra began to reveal itself through archaeology. Excavations uncovered the palace, temples, houses, tombs, and tablets. The buried city became readable again, not all at once, but layer by layer. That is how Ugarit returned. not as a living city, as evidence. And maybe that is fitting, because Ugarit's greatest survival was not its walls, it was its words. Clay is humble material. It does not look precious like gold. It does not shine like bronze. But for ancient history, clay can be more generous than treasure. Gold tells us people had wealth. Clay tells us what they worried about. A gold cup is beautiful. A tablet saying the enemy has come is alive in a different way. That is why the last letters matter. They are not elegant. They are not written for us. They are practical, formal, urgent, and incomplete. But they bring us closer to the final weeks or months of a city than many monuments ever could. We can feel the pressure through them. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but enough. The city's destruction also preserved some of those tablets because fire hardened the clay. That fact is often repeated because it is almost unbearable. The fire that ended the palace helped keep the palace's last words. There is no need to decorate that. Just let it stand. The fire preserved the fear. After Ugarit was destroyed, it was not rebuilt as the same kingdom. That is another important difference. Some cities burn and come back. Some are conquered and continue under another name. Some shrink, recover, and find a new life. Ugarit, as that late Bronze Age city kingdom, stopped. The archive stopped. The royal voice stopped. The administrative machine stopped. The harbour did not stop being a place by the sea. The land did not vanish. People in the region did not disappear from the earth. But Ugarit, as Ugarit was finished. That kind of ending is not always visually dramatic after the fact. A ruin can look calm. Stones in the sun, excavation trenches, labels, museum cases. But we should remember what the calm is covering. Rooms where things were left, tablets fallen, buildings burned, a city interrupted. Not completed, interrupted. There is a difference. A completed thing feels finished from inside itself. An interrupted thing still carries the shape of what it was trying to do. Ugarit feels interrupted, letters in motion, warnings unfinished, questions unanswered. That is why it belongs to the night. Because sleeplessness also understands interruption, the thought that does not finish, the day that keeps returning, the answer that does not come, the mind waiting for something it cannot name. Maybe that is why ancient letters feel close in a dark room. A letter is always a form of waiting. Someone sends it because they are not where the answer is. They put urgency into words and send those words across distance. A letter says, "I cannot reach you myself, so let this reach you for me." At Ugarit, the letters traveled through a world where distance had become dangerous. Let us look again at Amurapi's position. He is tied to Hatti. His troops and chariots are away there. His ships are in Lucca. Enemy ships have attacked. He writes to Al-Ashir. This is a network in one paragraph. Hatti, Lucca, Al-Ashir, Ugarit, sea routes, military obligations, diplomatic communication. Everything that made the late Bronze Age international system impressive is present in the problem, and everything is failing at the wrong time. That is why a single city can show us a whole age. Not because Ugarit caused the collapse. It did not. Not because Ugarit was the center of the world. It was not. But because the pressures of the world passed through it, like wind through a broken doorway. We can imagine other people reading the signs before the final destruction. A merchant who knows that trade has become too risky. A palace official who sees the stores and does not like the numbers. A soldier's wife who hears that the troops will not return soon. A priest who notices more people coming to the temple, with fear rather than gratitude. A dock worker who has seen enough harbors to know when a harbor is nervous. None of them has to understand the whole collapse. They only need to understand that Ugarit is less safe than it was. People living through history rarely receive the full title of the event. No one says, the late Bronze Age international system is undergoing multi-causal collapse. They say, the ships are late. They say, food is short. They say, the enemy is near. They say, send word. They say, we should leave. They say, wait. They say, surely the king knows. They say, surely help is coming. And then maybe one day they stop saying surely. That is when fear changes. Fear with hope is restless. Fear without confidence becomes heavy. We do not know the exact last day of Ugarit, and we should not pretend that we do. That is one of the ways historical storytelling can become dishonest. We do not know whether Amurapi stood in a palace room and watched smoke from the harbour. We do not know whether the final attack came at night or day. We do not know the last sentence spoken by the last scribe. We do not know whether people fled early, late, or not at all. We do not know whether the king survived the destruction or died in it. Some of that will stay dark, and it should. But we know enough to tell the story carefully. We know the city was under pressure. We know enemy ships caused damage. We know Amurapi's troops and chariots were not where he needed them. We know his ships were away. We know Ugarit was destroyed around 1200 BCE. We know its archives stopped. We know the city was not rebuilt as the same kingdom. That is enough. A historian does not need to fill every shadow with invention. Sometimes the shadow is part of the truth. So let us keep the last scene modest. No giant speech, no perfect final image, just a city under pressure, the harbour uncertain, the palace still lit, officials moving through rooms, a scribe trying to keep the writing straight, someone asking whether a message has been sent, someone else asking whether any reply has come. Maybe the answer is no, maybe the answer is not yet. Those two answers can sound almost the same when time is short. Outside the palace, life is still happening because life does not stop politely for history. Someone is making food. Someone is looking for a missing person. Someone is hiding something valuable. Someone is saying that rumors are always worse than reality. Someone is thinking the opposite, but not saying it. A city near the end would not have one emotion. There would be denial, panic, duty, confusion, anger, faith, exhaustion, and routine, all moving through the same streets at the same time. People continue because stopping would be another kind of death. The palace may still try to project control. That is what palaces do. There may be orders, guards, formal speech, rituals, seals, hierarchy, but control is not the same as safety. A palace can still give orders after events have outgrown it. That may be what we are seeing at Ugarit. A government still speaking, but no longer able to make the world obey. The same thing happened elsewhere in different ways. The Mycenaean palace system in Greece fell apart. The Hittite imperial structure vanished. Egypt survived, but weakened. Cities along the Levantine coast changed or burned. Trade routes shifted. Writing disappeared in some places and continued in others. But we do not need to travel through all of that again tonight. We did that last time. Tonight, we let the whole age be seen through one place. Ugarit is enough. The late Bronze Age world had been proud of connection. And why not? Connection brought wealth. Connection brought bronze. Connection brought luxury goods, diplomatic marriages, shared artistic styles, technical skill, and the sense that great kings belonged to a common world. But connection also means dependence. If you depend on copper from one place, grain from another, protection from another, and sea routes between them, then your strength is not only inside your walls, it is stretched across water, across roads, across promises, across other people's stability. That can work beautifully, until it does not. Ugarit's fall shows the cost of stretched strength. The city had resources, but the key resources were not in the right place at the right moment. Ships away, troops away, help uncertain, danger near. That is the whole tragedy in plain words. No need for a perfect metaphor. The plain words are enough. Still, the human mind looks for images, especially at night. So we return to clay. Clay begins soft. It takes the pressure of a hand. A reed stylus presses a wedge, then another, then another. Names, places, warnings, respect, fear. The clay can dry. It can be fired. It can break. It can survive. A tablet is a small thing. You can hold it. It does not look like a world. But sometimes a world passes through a small thing. A few lines on clay can carry a palace room, a king's anxiety, a harbor's danger, an empire's weakness, and a city's last attempt to be heard. That is what Ugarit gives us. Not the whole Bronze Age, but a piece of it still warm with fear. Maybe this is why the city is more haunting than some larger ruins. Large ruins can become impressive and distant. A huge wall makes you admire. A last letter makes you listen. It puts you in the position of the receiver. You read what someone needed another person to know. Enemy ships came. Damage was done. The forces are away. The land is exposed. What would you do with such a message? If you had power, would you answer? Could you answer? Would your own ships be ready? Would your own fields be safe? Would your own people be asking the same thing? This is another part of collapse. Everyone needs help at once. A network works when not every part is desperate at the same time. If one city suffers, others can send grain. If one coast is attacked, troops can move. If one harvest fails, stores can cover the shortage. But if too many places are strained together, the logic changes. Help becomes scarce. Promises become delayed. Each ruler looks first to his own walls, and then the old language of brotherhood between kings becomes thinner. Not meaningless, just weaker than fear. At Ugarit, the letter to Alashia belongs to that world. Two coastal powers, both looking at the sea, both knowing that ships can bring wealth or disaster, both knowing that what happens to one shore may soon matter to the other. The message is not only about Ugarit, it is a warning. Watch your coast. The danger is moving. That is how fear travels in a connected world, not just as panic, as information. One city's disaster becomes another city's preparation if there is still time. But there may not have been enough time. Time is one of the hidden characters in this story. Not a god, not a king, but always there. How long for a message to travel? How long for troops to return from Hatti? How long for ships to return from Lucca? How long before the enemy comes again? How long can the city feed itself? How long can officials maintain order? How long before people stop believing the palace? Collapse is partly a story about timing. The wrong forces in the wrong place. The right warning too late. The right ally too busy. The right road unsafe. The right system too slow. If anything had happened at a different pace, maybe Ugarit would have had another season. Maybe. But history does not owe cities good timing. It gives what it gives. And around 1200 BCE, many places received too much at once. We can pause here and notice something. Ugarit's story is sad, but it is not only sad because a city was destroyed. Many cities were destroyed in ancient history. Ugarit is sad because we can hear it trying not to be destroyed. That is different. A silent ruin invites imagination. An urgent archive invites empathy. The people were not waiting passively for fate. They were writing, warning, asking, managing, counting, sending. trying. And sometimes trying is the thing that survives. The attempt remains in clay even after the outcome is lost. This is where the story becomes quiet again. Because after the fire, there is not much more for Ugarit to say. The palace no longer produces the same stream of records. The royal correspondence stops. The old administrative world stops. The city's name continues in scholarship, in tablets, in excavation reports, in museum labels, but not as a living Bronze Age kingdom. The voice is cut off. We should let that be abrupt. Not every ending needs a long explanation. Sometimes the line simply stops. There is a tablet, then no more. There is a king, then no more kingdom. There is a harbour, then no more old traffic. There is a room full of records, then ash. And because the city stopped speaking, everything after that has to be reconstructed from broken things. Fragments, layers, comparisons, other people's records, careful guesses. That is the work of archaeology and history. It is slow work, patient work, not as dramatic as the fall itself, but maybe more faithful. A broken tablet does not shout, it waits. Someone has to read it closely. Someone has to accept what it says and what it does not say. That is important for us too, because stories like this attract overconfidence. People want one cause. The sea peoples did it, drought did it, earthquakes did it, trade collapse did it, rebellion did it, the Hittites failed, the palace economy failed. Each of those may hold part of the truth, but a part is not the whole. For Ugarit, we can say there were enemy attacks, military absence, wider instability, Hittite weakness, and a dangerous sea. We can say the city stood inside a network under stress. We can say it was destroyed and not restored as before. That is already a strong story. We do not need to make it cleaner than the evidence allows. Clean stories are comforting. History is not always comforting. Sometimes it is more honest to leave several causes in the room together and not force one to dominate. The people of Ugarit did not experience multi-causal collapse. They experienced fear, but we, looking back, should be careful enough not to betray that fear by turning it into a simple cartoon. The enemy was real. The collapse was real. But so were the structures that made Ugarit vulnerable. The city was not just murdered by outsiders. It was caught in the failure of the world that had made it prosperous. That is a harder story, and a better one. As the Bronze Age faded, the Eastern Mediterranean did not become empty. That is another thing to remember. After collapse, people still live. They farm. They move. They rebuild elsewhere. They change language. They adopt new tools. They form smaller communities. They remember. They forget. New powers eventually rise. The Iron Age comes, slowly and unevenly. Phoenician cities become important. Alphabetic writing spreads. Israelite, Aramaean, Philistine, and other identities take shape in new ways. Assyria later rises with terrible force. Greece, after a long transformation, produces new forms of city life. The world after Ugarit was not a blank page, but for Ugarit itself, as that city kingdom, the page had ended. That is the scale of tonight, not the end of humanity, not the end of the Mediterranean, not even the end of all life on that coast, the end of one particular voice, one political body, one archive-bearing city by the sea. And sometimes that is enough to mourn. We do not need the whole world to end for a loss to matter. A city is a world to the people inside it. Let us spend a little time with that idea. A city is not only walls, it is expectation. You know where to buy bread. You know which street floods. You know which official is corrupt. You know where your cousin lives. You know which temple your mother visits. You know which warehouse has work. You know the smell of the harbour when the wind comes from the sea. You know what the palace movements mean, even if no one explains them to you. A city teaches itself into the body. Then danger comes, and suddenly familiar places become strange. The street you know becomes a route of escape. The harbour you trusted becomes a threat. The palace that ordered life becomes a place people watch with suspicion. That transformation is part of collapse too. The world does not only change on maps, it changes in the way a person looks at the end of their own street. Ugarit must have had such moments. We cannot name them, but we can leave space for them. One evening, perhaps, someone saw smoke and understood it was not ordinary. Someone heard a rumor and knew this time it was not just a rumor. Someone looked at the harbour and did not like the emptiness. Someone inside the palace realized the next letter might not matter. Maybe that is too imaginative. Maybe not. The evidence gives us the conditions. Human life fills them quietly. Now, toward the end of this night, we can bring the story back to the letters themselves. Why do they matter? Because they are not written after the fall. They are not later poems about a lost city. They are not historians trying to arrange causes. They belong to the event. They stand close to the heat. They do not know the ending, and because of that, they are more honest than a polished story. They show people trying to act before the future closed. That is what makes them different from ruins. A ruin says, "Something happened here." A last letter says, "Something is happening here." There is still breath in that, even now, even after 3,000 years. The tablet sits silent in a museum or study, but the grammar of urgency remains. A king addressing another ruler, a report of enemy ships, a statement of absence, troops away, ships away, country exposed. Those facts do not need music behind them. They have their own rhythm, a bad rhythm, the rhythm of a system out of alignment. If you listen closely, Ugarit's last letters are not only saying we are in danger, they are saying the world is not where it is supposed to be. The army is supposed to defend the land. It is elsewhere. The ships are supposed to guard the coast. They are elsewhere. Allies are supposed to answer. Too slow. The sea is supposed to bring trade. It brings threat. The palace is supposed to control. It records its own helplessness. That reversal is the story. A world turned slightly wrong, then more wrong, until it cannot return. We can understand that without forcing a modern comparison. Ancient Ugarit was its own place, with its own gods, economy, hierarchy, violence, beauty and fear. But the feeling of systems failing is not entirely foreign. Humans know what it is to wait for an answer, to depend on something far away, to learn that a structure is weaker than it looked, to keep using old words because new ones have not arrived yet. That is why this old city can still sit with us in the dark, not as a lesson shouted at us, just as company. A reminder that other people, very far away in time, also lived inside uncertainty. They also waited. They also sent messages. They also hoped the road would hold, and sometimes it did not. The last letters of Ugarit do not give us comfort exactly, but they give us contact, and contact is something. Across the distance we can say, "We heard you," not in time to help. No, never in time. But enough to remember that you were not just a ruin. You were a city, you were a harbour, you were scribes and sailors and priests and workers and children and officials and merchants and frightened households. You were a king whose ships were away. You were a message sent into a failing world. You were not a footnote to someone else's collapse. You were there. Maybe that is all history can do sometimes. Not save, not repair, not answer. Only refuse to let the silence become complete. So tonight we let Ugarit remain partly itself, not fully explained, not flattened into a simple cause, not turned into a clean myth. A city on the Syrian coast, Ras Shamra in the earth, Minet el Beda by the water, a palace archive, Amurapi, Alashia, Hatti, Lucca, enemy ships, absent troops, absent ships, clay hardened by fire, a final voice. That is enough. The Hittites can wait for another night. They have their own roads, their own capital, their own disappearance into the Anatolian dark. The Sea Peoples can wait too. They deserve careful handling, not a convenient shadow. Egypt can stand in the distance, old and wounded, telling its own version on temple walls. Tonight, we stay where the letters are. We stay with the city that wrote before it went quiet. And now the harbor is dark again. Not because we know exactly how the final night looked. We do not. But because the image is simple enough to hold. Water against stone. Ropes moving softly. No ship where one should be. A palace lamp still burning somewhere inland. A tablet drying. A messenger waiting. Or maybe no messenger at all. The old world is not gone everywhere yet. But here, it is close. Close enough to hear. Close enough to change the air. Someone asks if help is coming. Someone else does not answer. Maybe they do not know. Maybe they know too well. The city waits, and the waiting becomes part of its last history. Ugarit was destroyed. The archives stopped. The kingdom did not return, but the letters remained. That is why we can still speak its name tonight. Not loudly. There is no need, just enough. Ugarit, a small kingdom in a large age, a port city that listened to the sea, a place made rich by connection and endangered when connection failed, a city that tried to use the old channels one more time, a city whose last words were not victory, but need. If you are still awake, that is all right. You do not have to force yourself anywhere. The night can stay open a little longer. The room around you is still here. The dark is not empty. It has old harbors in it, old roads, old tablets, old unanswered letters. Far behind us, the sea moves against the stones of Minet el Beda. Somewhere inland, the ruins of Ras Shamra hold their silence. The palace is gone, the king is gone, the ships are gone, but the clay kept a little of the fear. And for a few quiet minutes we kept it company. That is enough for tonight. No clean ending, no final answer. Just a city by the sea, a message sent too late, and the dark settling over the last letters of Ugarit. You are still in the Insomnia Club, and for a little while longer, you do not have to sit with the dark alone.